Greetings once again, my ghosts and gentlefolds. Back by most unpopular demand, it's me, the Creepster!
Oh, wonderful. Cursed once again by your presence on my otherwise factual channel.
Hey, listen, bub. My union contract says at minimum one spooky story per calendar year. And need I remind you, you skimped out on me in the last one.
Union contract? You're part of SAG?
No, Ghost, Ghouls, and Goblins Local 666.
Oh, I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, so unless you want to hear from my union rep, cut the sass and get with the spookiness. And believe me, you don't want to summon the union rep.
Alright, fine. I got one about a frozen ghost ship, one called the Octavius.
Oh, a frigid tale of foolish Arctic centaurs trapped in a frozen tempest in time. Something to truly chill the listeners to the bone. I love it. I love it. Play on, maestro. Play on.
October 11th, 1775. In the large cold stretch of sea west of Greenland, a whaling ship plies the waters of the Labrador Sea as far north as Baffin Bay, trying in vain to take home quarry before the cold Arctic ices stretch southwards, making the waters impossible to traverse. Being mid-October, mist and gray clouds blot the blue sky and cause frigid cold spray to splash over the bow of the whale ship. Captain of the whaling ship Herald needed a catch before turning southwards and returning to Europe. On this day, the lookout bellowed a call from the crow's nest, but he hadn't spotted a fluke or a spout, but the masts of another ship drifting south from Baffin Bay. Perhaps another whaler, not much other reason for a ship to be this far north. The captain decided it was a good idea to heave to and meet this mysterious mariner, but upon his approach, the crew was slowly unsettled. The three-masted schooner's sails were shoddily set, and the ship looked worse for wear. A small schooner of around 100 feet in length, her sides were beaten, the wood splintered in places. Her rigging lay frayed and tattered, and her masts looked beaten and torn. She looked like a ship that had sailed into hell and back. Her decks were caked with ice, and they seemed devoid of life. The mate hailed the ship as they approached, but received no answer. He called again in French, to no avail. Dutch, German, Spanish, not a sound returned, just the creaking of beleaguered wood and the whistle of wind through torn sails. The ship drifted past the Herald as the whaler's crew assembled at the rail, uneasily watching the silent merchant sail past. As they took her stern, they saw in worn black letters, Octavius. Now the captain was no longer concerned about where to find elusive whales, but more so the mystery of the drifting merchant ship. A merchant ship to drift without a crew meant a possible hold full of salvage and maybe a bigger payday. A boarding party of the mate and 4 men was assembled, loaded into one of the ship's whaling cutters, and sent over to the drifting Octavius. The men rowed in near silence over to the ice-coated schooner, eyes scanning the lifeless decks. As they approached, tattered and frayed lines drifted behind her, like the tendrils of jellyfish adrift on the tides. They navigated carefully next to her, making off a line and delicately hopping aboard, something not easily done with the amount of ice built up on her rails. The Octavius sagged and swayed, the frost upon her masts and decks making the ship dangerously top-heavy. Though if the Octavius's crew were aware of the boarders, they made no indication. The 5 men may as well have been stepping onto the surface of the moon. They were not greeted. There wasn't a sound other than water sloshing against the derelict's side. The mate, being a rather stocky and valiant fellow, took point, leading the men along ice-strewn decks. Not a soul was met until they made the hatch leading below decks. The lower decks were dark and as cold as an icebox. For a moment, the men stumbled in darkness, the mate stumbling over a rolled mat or perhaps a hemp hawser. He called for a lantern, and a sailor provided one. As the mate shone a light at his feet, he turned as white as the ice about him. There, seated and slumped over, lay a dead sailor, frozen solid and dead for quite some time, preserved by the ice. His eyes were wide open as if he had died in an instant. It took a moment to calm the 4 others, but the mate finally did so before pressing onwards. Below decks, they found more of the crew, dead, frozen, laying or sitting about the decks. Seemingly dead in place, but all dead by one cause: freezing. In the crew's quarters, they found nearly a dozen in hammocks and sitting about. In total, they found about 24 men. That was when they found the captain's cabin, in a rather macabre scene. The captain of the Octavius sat at his desk, his cabin cold enough to hang meat in. His eyes were open, staring as if irritated at these invaders of his stateroom. But he was stone dead. In his hand he clutched a quill, as if he had been filling out a log when the icy hand of death fell upon him. He wasn't alone, though. Sat huddled next to him, wrapped in blankets, were 2 smaller forms, a woman and a young boy. Also in the room was a sailor holding a tinderbox, as if trying in vain to stave off the lethal cold. Not a soul aboard was alive, and the clues to their demise were as elusive as the warmth. By this point, it took all the mate's willpower to keep himself from bolting, let alone his 4 shipmates, all of which believed the ship cursed. But, doing his due diligence, the mate grabbed the logbook that was clutched in the deceased captain's hands and retreated from the cabin. The ancient logbook was half frozen, and the bindings gave, leaving them with only the first page and the last page. But they fled in haste, all the same, fearful that they too may succumb to the Octavius's curse and join her crew of the damned for eternity. They hustled above decks and aboard the cutter and cast off, thankful to be off and away from that frozen casket. The captain aboard the Herald asked if the ship could be brought to port, of which all 5 men vehemently disavowed the idea. One even recommending scuttling the merchant ship, an idea that was passed over due to difficulty and fear of going back aboard. Instead, the captain opted to cut his losses and return home. That evening, the logbook, or what remained of it, was picked over for clues. What it revealed was an abysmal tale. The ship, indeed named the Octavius, departed London in mid-1761, 13 years prior. On board was a load of English goods, bound for the Orient, China to be exact. The crew was 28, which included the captain, his son, and controversially, his wife. How the journey had gone from England to China was unknown, but what is known was that it went well enough and they arrived in China within a year. After selling off their goods, they loaded the holds with goods from the Orient, much sought after items in England. It was summer when they departed, and the weather was notably and unseasonably warm. The captain made a surprise and lethal decision. He would take a shortcut home through the yet unexplored Northwest Passage. So off they sailed into that inhospitable stretch of frozen seas, the captain soon discovering his folly, but far too late. Reaching a point 250 miles north of modern-day Point Barrow, Alaska, or as it was called then, Utqiagvik, Alaska, the sea ice set in and trapped the small schooner, a ship which had little to no hope of breaking free of the ice. The last log was dated November 11th, 1762. The final position being 75 degrees north by 160 degrees west. The ship was therefore not seen again for 13 years, but had frozen and thawed over and over, drifting upon the northern tides until she was carried clear to the Atlantic and discovered by the Herald. Thus, the crew of the Octavius had successfully navigated the Northwest Passage almost 100 years before the Franklin expedition, only doing so posthumously. As the Herald sailed south and the mast of the Octavius dipped beneath the horizons, the frozen ghost ship was never seen again. The crew aboard drifted on, perhaps coming up on the rocky Greenland shore and being dashed to pieces. Maybe taking on too much ice and capsizing, or maybe swinging north and becoming entrapped in the ice for decades more. We may never know, but her tale shall live on, a testament to the follies of hubris and the lethal circumstances of disrespecting the frigid Arctic North.
And there you have it, a titillating tale of man's hubris, culminating in the deliciously devilish end for a crew that dared the impossible and paid the ultimate price. A reason not to bet against Neptune when death is on the line. A reason not to foolhardily throw all of one's eggs in the proverbial...
Now hold on. That foolish decision is what has me questioning this.
Oh, right. I forgot what channel this was. We can't just enjoy a good ghost story. You have to go ruin it with reasoning. Gotta shit on my good ghost story, huh? Well, shit away, I suppose.
This is a factual channel. I like to maintain that integrity, thank you. Well, this story is rife with the usual failings of most ghost ship stories. The first being the inconsistencies in retelling. While this story popped up from time to time, it was famously retold in a Philadelphia-based newspaper in 1828, almost every aspect of the story being the same right down to the exact date, though this time the ship was named the Gloriana, and no mention was made of the Northwest Passage. This is probably why, seeing as the Northwest Passage, a huge element of the story, is easily the hardest part to believe in this story. This is in the 1760s. The Northwest Passage wasn't unknown, there had been attempts to navigate it before, but none had come even close, and many had died attempting to find it. We know that nearly 100 years later, a government-funded expedition by professional explorers had attempted it, the infamous Franklin expedition. With the best equipment, the best ships suited for the job, and trained explorers, they tried and failed to find a way through, every single one of them perishing in the attempt. So why then would a merchant schooner with the captain's son and wife aboard would he attempt it on a whim, simply because it felt a bit unseasonably warm? That's like me taking my family out for a flight in a Cessna and saying, well gosh, it's a full moon tonight, why don't we try flying to it? Might be easier than usual. No pertinent mariner would attempt that. Even if they did attempt it, the hulls of other Arctic expedition ships were heavily reinforced against the sea ice in the passage. A normal schooner spending 13 years up there would have likely been crushed to pieces by sea ice. It makes the story very difficult to believe. Coupled with other minor things such as the men aboard freezing with their eyes open or at their stations. This doesn't occur. We know for a fact that most that succumb to hypothermia tend to fall asleep or unconscious and simply don't wake up. We also have the very convenient fact that only part of the logbook was saved with no attempt to get the rest of it, and that even the bit that was saved was never kept on record. In summary, it's a fun story, but either heavily embellished over the years or just a downright fabrication.
Thanks, Captain Curmudgeon, for the way to kill the magic. Well, I say, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Happy Halloween, my scary shipmates. And I shall see you next year.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see.
Oh my, how cute. You thought that was optional. I will see you next year.
Yeah, next year sounds good. And, fair winds and following seas to you, shipmates.